The wind on the Battle River ranges was running close to 40 kilometers an hour out of the northwest that morning, gusting harder in the open ground past the 400-meter berm, and Warrant Officer Maddox had chosen exactly that kind of weather to make a point in front of everybody. He set the rifle down on the mat himself, which was the first thing that told the watching soldiers something was off, because warrant officers did not generally crouch in the frost to lay out another shooter's kit. He thumbed the bolt closed on a single round, stood and gestured with 2 fingers down the lane toward a steel plate so far out it shimmered in the cold air like something half-remembered. 1,600 meters, no spotter, no warm-up, no data on paper. A cold barrel in -11, a crosswind that changed its mind every few seconds, and a woman who had been on the detachment for less than a day. "Whenever you're ready, Master Corporal," Maddox said, and the way he said the rank made it sound like a courtesy he was doing her. The dozen men strung along the firing point were already half grinning. A couple of them had their phones out, low against their thighs where the range staff couldn't see. Somebody near the ammunition table muttered that this was going to be quick. Somebody else laughed, a short bark of a laugh that the wind took and scattered. Hargrove did not say anything. She crouched, picked up the rifle, and turned it over in her hands once, slowly, the way a person checks the weight of something they intend to trust their reputation to. Then she lay down behind it. What the men on the line could not have known, what Maddox himself did not know, because he had read exactly 4 lines of her file before deciding what she was, is that the human eye is a remarkably good instrument for reading wind if it has been trained for 10,000 hours to do it. The mirage running across the scrub at 800 meters was bending in a particular way. The seed heads on the prairie grass were laid over at a particular angle and then snapping upright in the lulls. A flag at the midpoint, frozen half-stiff, was doing arithmetic for anyone who knew the language. Most people looked at all of that and saw weather. A very small number of people looked at it and saw a number. Hargrove saw a number. She held for 9 minutes of wind, left, came down 0.2 of a mil for the cold, thickened air, settled her natural point of aim so that her body, not her muscles, was holding the crosshair where she wanted it, and let the rifle settle into the pause between her own heartbeats. There is a window there, about 3/4 of a second long, when the chest is still and the pulse has not yet kicked the reticle. People who can find that window reliably are rare. People who can find it while a warrant officer stands over them, hoping they fail, are rarer still. The shot broke clean. For a moment there was only the wind. Then, faintly, from 1,600 meters out, came the flat, metallic gong of a bullet finding steel dead center. The sound arriving almost 3 full seconds after the rifle had spoken, the way distant truth always arrives a little late. Nobody laughed after that. There is a specific quality to the silence that falls over a group of confident men when one of them has just been proven wrong in front of the others, and it is not the same as ordinary quiet. It has weight. The phones went back into pockets. The grin slid off the face of the man at the ammunition table. Maddox stood very still with his jaw working, and the wind kept blowing, indifferent to all of them, because the wind had been the only honest party present from the beginning. If you have ever wanted to watch a room full of people who were certain about something discover, all at once, that they had been certain about the wrong thing, this is that story. And the part that mattered most, the part that took the longest to come out, had nothing to do with that first shot at all. The detachment Hargrove had been posted to was a long-range reconnaissance and marksmanship cell working out of a forward training site east of Wainwright, in the flat brown country where Alberta stops pretending it has hills and just lets the prairie run to the edge of the world. It was late November. The poplars had given up their leaves weeks ago and stood gray and bare along the coulees, and the cold came in off the open ground with nothing to slow it down. She had driven up alone the day before, in a government truck, with a single duffel and a hard case in the back, signed in at a guardhouse where a young corporal checked her face against her card twice and found her own way to quarters because nobody had been sent to meet her. That, too, told her something. People who are expected and welcome get met. People who are being tolerated as somebody else's decision find their own door. The somebody else in this case was a major named Frost. who ran the cell and who had requested Hargrove specifically over the quiet objection of nearly everyone under her. Frost was the kind of officer who had learned long ago that the best people in any specialized trade were almost never the ones the culture wanted, and that her job was to protect those people long enough for their work to speak for itself. She had read the whole file, not 4 lines of it, all of it, including the parts that were redacted and the parts that were not redacted but should have been, and she had come away from the reading certain of one thing: that the detachment needed Hargrove far more than Hargrove needed the detachment, and that this asymmetry was going to cause her a great deal of trouble. She was right about that. The trouble had a rank and a name, and it was Warrant Officer Maddox. It would be easy, and untrue, to paint Maddox as a simple villain. He was by most measures very good at his job. He had been the senior marksmanship instructor at the cell for 6 years. He had built the program from a few mats and a borrowed range into something that other units sent their people to. He had a wall of plaques and a way of standing that suggested he had earned every one of them, and he had decided, somewhere in the first 30 seconds of meeting Hargrove, that her presence was an insult. Not to him personally, he would have denied that strenuously, and believed the denial, but to the thing, the discipline, the craft he had spent his career defending. In his understanding of the world, marksmanship at the extreme distances was a fraternity earned through suffering, through years on the line, through a particular kind of stoic endurance that he associated, without ever quite saying so, with men. A woman who walked in and outshot his best people on a cold barrel with no warm-up did not fit the story he had told himself about why he was special. So he concluded, very fast, that there must be a trick to it. And once a person concludes that the truth is a trick, they will spend a remarkable amount of energy trying to expose it. The narrator pauses here to note something about human psychology, because it matters for everything that follows. People rarely sabotage what they believe to be genuinely superior. They sabotage what threatens the story they need to be true about themselves. Maddox did not lie awake hating Hargrove. He lay awake certain that he was protecting standards. That is the more dangerous kind of opponent, because they cannot be shamed out of it. They think they are the hero of the thing they are doing. In the days after the 1,600-meter shot, the detachment settled into an uneasy arrangement. Hargrove was assigned a spotter, a quiet corporal named Lachance from somewhere outside Trois-Rivières, who had a gift for staying out of the way and a habit of watching her work with the careful attention of a man trying to learn a language by listening. She drew the worst lane, the worst times, the equipment nobody else wanted. She accepted all of it without comment, which annoyed the people hoping she would complain, and she shot. She shot in the dark and in the wind and in the kind of blowing snow that turns a target into a rumor, and she logged everything. Every round, every condition, every correction, in a small waterproof notebook in handwriting so small and precise it looked typeset. What she was actually doing, though it took the others a while to understand it, was building a model. Long-range shooting at the distances she worked is not really about marksmanship in the ordinary sense. The holding and the trigger control are the price of admission, the table stakes. The real game is prediction. A bullet sent past a kilometer is in the air long enough to be pushed by wind that changes between the muzzle and the target, dropped by gravity, drifted sideways by the spin of its rifling, and bent, measurably, at those ranges, by the rotation of the planet itself. Most shooters manage these variables with a ballistic computer and a wind call and a certain amount of faith. Hargrove managed them the way other people manage a tune they have known since childhood. She had, somewhere in the architecture of her mind, an aptitude for holding many shifting quantities in relation to one another at once, and feeling, almost before she calculated, where they were going to land. The math was not a tool she used. It was closer to a sense she possessed. She had not always been allowed to use it. This is the part of the story that the men on the line did not know, and that Maddox would have refused to believe even if he had been told. Years earlier, in a place that does not need naming and a year that is still officially vague, a small team had been pinned in a riverbed by accurate fire from a position on a ridge that every available shooter had declared beyond range. The angle was bad. The wind in the valley was doing 3 different things at 3 different heights. The light was failing. The ballistic computers gave a firing solution with a probability of success so low that taking the shot was, statistically, almost the same as not taking it. And a single Canadian sniper, name withheld in every account that was ever written, had run the numbers by hand, called a wind nobody else could see, and made a shot at a distance that became, in the years after, a kind of legend in the community. The sort of story passed around at courses and in messages. The impossible shot, the one that proved the limit, was further out than anyone thought. Half the men standing on the Battle River line had told that story themselves. Maddox had told it more than once, in his instructor's voice, to impress the new arrivals. None of them knew it was her. She had never corrected the record. There were reasons, some of them about security, and most of them about the simple fact that she had not done it to be known. She had done it because a team was going to die otherwise, and the numbers said it was possible, barely, and she trusted the numbers more than she trusted her own fear. Afterwards, she had been quietly moved, quietly thanked, and quietly forgotten. The way people who make the unwelcome people in a system look ordinary tend to be forgotten. She had spent the years since then teaching, mostly, and being underestimated by men exactly like Maddox in installations exactly like this one, and she had stopped expecting that to change, so she did not tell them. She just shot, and she watched, and after a while she started to notice the broken one. His name was Sarazine, a corporal barely 2 years in, and he had arrived at the cell a year ago as the most promising young shooter anyone had seen in a decade. By the time Hargrove got there, he could barely keep his rounds on a plate at 600 meters. The official explanation was that he had lost his nerve. The unofficial explanation, the one nobody said out loud, was that Maddox had broken him. Not deliberately, but in the way a certain kind of instructor breaks a sensitive student by treating every miss as a moral failure until the student's hands began to shake at the firing point in anticipation of being shamed for the shaking. Sarazin had developed a flinch. At the moment the rifle should have settled, his body, bracing for the recoil and the criticism both, threw the shot, and the more it happened, the more certain he became that it would happen, which guaranteed that it would. Hargrove watched him miss for 3 days before she said anything. On the 4th, in the gray light before the others came out, she found him at the cleaning bench with the haunted look of a man rehearsing his own failure, and she sat down across from him and she did not mention his shooting at all. She asked him about the math. "Do you know why your rounds are stringing left when the wind's from the right?" she asked. He didn't. Most people didn't. She drew it for him on a scrap of paper. The way a right-hand twist of rifling makes a bullet drift to the right as it slows, and how at certain ranges and certain crosswinds, the spin drift and the wind push and the vertical wander all braided together into a pattern that looked like inconsistency, but was actually a signature, repeatable, predictable, solvable. She showed him that the thing terrifying him was not chaos. It was a system, and systems could be understood, and a thing that is understood stops being frightening in the particular way that only the unknown can frighten a person. The narrator notes, because it is the heart of this whole account, that there is a specific moment when a person who has decided they are broken realizes they might only have been confused, and that the difference between those two states is the whole difference between a ruined life and a saved one. Sarazine had that moment at a cleaning bench at 5:30 in the morning, looking at a pencil diagram of spindrift. His shoulders came down from around his ears. For the first time in months, he did not become a great shooter that morning, but he stopped being a frightened one, and from a frightened shooter to a competent one is a shorter road than most people believe. She did the same thing, in different forms, for others. A reservist who had convinced himself he couldn't read Mirage, when in fact he read it fine and simply didn't trust himself. A sergeant named Beaudry, one of the loudest skeptics in the first week, who came to her privately about a problem he'd been having with his groups opening up at distance, half expecting her to lord it over him, and instead found her diagnosing a barely perceptible inconsistency in his bolt manipulation in about 90 seconds, the way a good mechanic hears the bad bearing the moment the car comes up the drive. Beaudry, who was not a stupid man, recalibrated his entire opinion of her in the space of that one conversation. It is worth saying plainly The people who actually worked with her changed their minds fast. It was only the man who would not work with her, who watched from a distance and told himself stories, who hardened. And Maddox was hardening, because something had been set in motion that he could not stop. The cell was 3 weeks out from a selection board, a formal evaluation that would decide which shooters were certified for a new long-range program. Frost had fought for 2 years to stand up, a program built around exactly the kind of extended distance, mathematically modeled shooting that was Hargrove's whole reason for existing. If Hargrove certified, she would effectively become the technical authority for the program. She would set the standards. She would, in the quiet bureaucratic way these things actually happen, eclipse Maddox in the one domain he had spent his career owning. He understood this with total clarity, and so he made a decision that he justified to himself as protecting the integrity of the evaluation, and that was, in plain terms, an attempt to engineer her failure in front of the board. It started small. Her allotted practice times got moved, always to the worst conditions. A requisition for the specific match ammunition she had been using to build her data. Ammunition that had to be lot matched to be meaningful, because different production lots of the same cartridge can have velocity variations large enough to throw a shot off a target at extreme range. Got mysteriously delayed, and she was issued a mixed lot instead, which to a casual observer looked identical, and to her data was poison. Then the evaluation date itself got moved up by 4 days, with a justification about range availability that did not survive close inspection, timed precisely to land in the window when her cold weather data would be least complete. Frost saw the shape of it before Hargrove said a word. She called Hargrove into her office on a gray afternoon with the wind rattling the storm windows and laid it out, because she believed the people she protected deserved to know what was being done to them. "You understand what's happening," Frost said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. He's going to put you in front of the board on a mixed ammunition lot, in conditions you haven't fully mapped, on a compressed timeline, and when your numbers come up short, he's going to stand there and say the program is unproven." Frost's voice was flat and tired, and he'll believe he did the right thing. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need the lot-matched ammunition logged and signed for, and I need the supply discrepancy documented before the board, not after. If it comes out after, it looks like an excuse." Frost studied her. "You're not worried about the shooting." "No, ma'am." It was not arrogance, and Frost understood that it wasn't. It was something closer to the calm of a person who has done a frightening thing once, with lives in the balance, and has therefore lost the ability to be frightened by an evaluation. "I'm worried about the record. If he gets to control the record, he wins even if I hit every plate. I need the record to be honest. The shooting will take care of itself." There is a kind of courage that looks like nothing at all from the outside. It does not raise its voice. It asks for the paperwork to be in order. Frost, who had spent a career around the louder kinds of courage, recognized the rarer kind when it sat across the desk from her, and she leaned in. "Get me the supply discrepancy in writing," she said. "I'll handle the chain. But Hargrove," and here she paused, because she was about to say the thing that made it real, "Maddox is meeting with the board president tonight. Lieutenant Colonel Vandermeer. Off the books. I found out an hour ago. Whatever he's going to say to poison the well, he's going to say it before you ever pick up a rifle." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind threw a handful of fine snow against the glass. "Then I'd better see the colonel first," Hargrove said. She did not see the colonel first. The narrator records this honestly, because the story is not the kind where the clever protagonist outmaneuvers everyone with a perfect plan. Vandermeer was busy, and the meeting with Maddox happened, and whatever was said in it, Hargrove walked into the days before the board, carrying the knowledge that the most powerful man in the room had already been told, privately and persuasively, that she was a fluke and her program a liability. What she did instead was the only thing she had ever really known how to do. She went back to the line, and she rebuilt her data from nothing on the mixed lot she had been given, treating the bad ammunition not as a sabotage but as a problem, chronographing every round she could spare, sorting them by velocity, building correction tables for the variance itself, turning the poison into one more variable to be solved. It was, Baudry said later, the most impressive thing he had ever watched a human being do with a rifle and a notebook. And Baudry had been doing this for 19 years. She slept 4 hours a night. Latchens, her spotter, stopped going back to quarters and slept on a cot in the equipment room to be available whenever she wanted to shoot, which was most of the time, because the wind on the prairie does not keep office hours, and she needed data in every condition the board might throw at her. And Sarrazin, the broken corporal she had quietly put back together, appeared at the range at 4 in the morning one day without being asked, and started running the chronograph for her, and then the next day brought 2 others, and within a few days there was a small group of people who had decided, without any of them quite announcing it, that they were on her side. They were the ones she had helped. People remember who treated them as a problem to be understood rather than a failure to be punished. It is the cheapest investment in the world, and almost nobody makes it. The board convened on a morning so cold the rifles had to be brought to the line slowly to keep the metal from contracting unevenly, a morning of hard blue sky and a wind that the range flags showed was running 15 to 25 out of the west. Gusty, the worst kind. The kind that does not let a shooter settle into a rhythm because the rhythm keeps changing. Lieutenant Colonel Vandermeer stood at the control point with 3 other evaluators, a clipboard, and an expression that gave nothing away. Maddox stood a little apart, arms folded, with the stillness of a man waiting to be proven right. The evaluation was built to be brutal. A cold bore shot at an unknown distance, scored on the first round only, because the first round from a cold barrel behaves differently than every round after it, and the program needed shooters who could deliver when it counted rather than after a warm-up. Then a series of engagements at increasing distance, against time, in the live wind, with the scoring weighted so that there was nowhere to hide. The other certified shooters went first. They were good. The cell did not certify the incompetent, and several of them put up scores that, on an ordinary day, would have been the talk of the mess for a week. Then Hargrove went. The narrator will not pretend to make the shooting itself dramatic in the way films make it dramatic, because the truth of it was almost unbearably calm. She lay down behind the rifle. She read the wind off the grass and the mirage and the flags, and she read it off the behavior of the rounds the previous shooters had sent, which she had been quietly logging in her head the whole time. She built her firing solution in the space of a few breaths, accounting for the cold air, the spindrift, the planet's slow turn beneath the bullet's flight, and the velocity variance of the mixed ammunition lot that Maddox had arranged for her to be issued. The very sabotage now folded silently into her math like just one more wind to be called. The cold bore round, scored on the first shot, struck the steel at an unknown distance of just over 1,400 meters dead in the center, the gong arriving across the frozen ground while the rifle was still settling. She did not miss again. Not on the timed engagements, not in the worst of the gusts, not when the wind switched direction halfway through a string. And 3 other certified shooters had thrown rounds wide. She shot the way water finds the bottom of a hill, without drama, without apparent effort, simply going where the physics said to go, because she had spent her whole life learning to listen to what the physics said. When it was over, her score was not merely the highest on the board. It was the highest the cell had ever recorded. And then, because Frost had done her own quiet work in the days before, the record came out honest. The supply discrepancy was in writing and on the table, documented and signed before the board rather than offered as an excuse after. The compressed timeline was noted. The mixed lot ammunition was logged, with Hargrove's own correction tables attached as evidence, not of an excuse, but of a competence so far beyond the room's expectation that one of the junior evaluators actually laughed out loud, a startled sound, when he understood what the tables meant. She had not just overcome the sabotage. She had turned the sabotage into the single most convincing demonstration of her ability that the board could have asked for. Vandermeer looked at the score sheet for a long time. Then he looked at Maddox. The narrator wishes to be honest about military reality here, because it is a thing the audience for stories like this one rightly cares about, and because the cheap version, where the villain simply storms off untouched, is a lie that insults everyone who is actually served. deliberately tampering with another member's evaluation, falsifying the conditions of a board, manipulating a supply chain to engineer a colleague's failure. These are not personality quirks. They are, in the institution Maddox belonged to, career-ending offenses, the kind that end with a person standing in front of a much harder board than this one, answering questions with a member's assisting officer at their elbow. Vandermeer was not a stupid man, and he had spent 30 years learning to read exactly the kind of careful, signed documentation that Frost had placed in front of him. He did not say anything to Maddox at the firing point. He did not need to. The look he gave him, and the quiet word he had with Frost afterward, and the formal review that opened the following week, said all of it. A man who had spent 6 years building a program had spent his last 3 weeks in it, ensuring that he would not be remembered for the building. Maddox was gone from the cell within the month. Not in disgrace exactly. The institution is quieter than that. But transferred, sidelined, his authority over the program he had created, handed to the woman he had tried to break. There is no triumph in it worth dwelling on. He had been good at his job once, and he had thrown it away to protect a story about himself. And that is closer to a tragedy than a victory, even for the people who were glad to see him go. The morning after the board, Hargrove was back on the line before dawn, because the program was real now, and there was work to do, and because the wind on the prairie had not heard the news and did not care. Sarrazin was already there, running rounds at 800 meters, with his shoulders down and his shots clustered tight. A young man who had been told he was finished and had turned out only to have been frightened, which is a much more curable condition. Baudry was setting up 2 lanes over, and when Hargrove walked past, he said, "Morning, Master Corporal," in the plain tone of a man who had simply, completely stopped doubting her, and that tone was worth more than any apology. Latchins had the spotoscope up and a fresh page in the data book. The light was coming up gray-gold over the coulees, and the cold had a clean edge to it, and somewhere out past 1,400 meters the steel plates stood waiting in the frost, patient and honest, ready to ring true or stay silent according to nothing but whether the shot was good. It is worth saying, at the end, what the whole thing came down to, because it is the same thing that the men on the line had failed to understand on that first windy morning and would spend the rest of their careers understanding. A target does not know who is holding the rifle. The wind does not care about rank or reputation or which story a person needs to be true about themselves. The bullet goes where the physics sends it, and the physics can be read by anyone willing to spend their whole life learning the language, and it cannot be argued with or charmed or shamed or told that it doesn't belong. The steel rings or it doesn't. That was the only judgment Hargrove had ever really trusted, through all the years of being underestimated in rooms full of certain men. And it was the only judgment that had never once been wrong about her. She had walked onto the range with a duffel bag and a notebook, and nobody to meet her, carrying a secret she had never asked anyone to believe. And in the end, she had not needed them to believe it. She had only needed the wind to blow and the distance to be honest. Both of them always were. She breathed out, found the still place between the beats of her own heart, and sent the first round of the morning downrange into the cold. And a long 3 seconds later, from far out across the frozen prairie, the steel answered her the way it always had, the only way that had ever counted.